All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome and thank you for joining part 2 of Sustainable Princeton's first Sustainable Minds virtual speakers series, Stormwater in Princeton. My name is Josh Perlsweig and I'm the program coordinator here at Sustainable Princeton. I also have Christine Symington and Jenny Ludmer with me, helping make sure that Zoom stays on track. So thank you to them. And Christine, next slide, please. Before we get started, we'd like to take a moment to thank our generous sponsor, NRG Energy, whose support allows us to bring you these events. Next slide, please. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website within a few days. You'll be able to find it by clicking the events tab and then webinar archives. We do have the first part from last week with Jim Purcell from the municipality posted, along with the slides and other resources that were shared. Next slide, please. I think we got one ahead, if we can go back one. Just want to mention that at any time during the webinar, you can click the Q&A button to enter questions. We will monitor them as they come in and then do our best to get them answered at the end of the program. The chat is on, but let's only use that if you have a technical Zoom question. So use the Q&A to actually get your questions for Marisa in. Next slide, please. Having a little there we go. Princeton's Climate Action Plan frames our conversation for tonight. It includes 85 actions to reduce our community's greenhouse gas emissions and makes us more resilient to the impact of climate change. These actions are divided into 5 sectors: energy, land use and transportation, natural resources, materials management, and resiliency, which is on topic for tonight. An increase in severity and frequency of storms means greater potential for flood damage, risks to life and property, and costs to clean up after an event. Next slide, please. A little more local context. The Office of the New Jersey Climatologist at Rutgers University tracks more than a century of local precipitation data. And here we can see an increasing trend in Mercer County with record-breaking precipitation over 60 inches occurring in 2018, 2011, 1996, and then 1975. Our 10-year average is over 48 inches of annual precipitation. Next slide, please. All right, we're going to launch a poll here just to get a little bit of background on folks who are attending. I'm going to launch this now. There are 3 questions. You do need to use the scroll bar to get down to them. First, are you, I'll read through them so we have time to answer, and when we get to the end of reading through, I'll close the poll. Are you a homeowner, renter, or commercial property owner in Princeton? And check any that apply. Actually, I also added business owner, because we do want to know how folks are impacted by stormwater and flooding. What watershed do you live in? If you attended last week, you might have a leg up on this one, and there are no wrong answers there. And have you experienced flooding? And this, we want to know sort of where and how you've experienced flooding on your property, in your yard, basement, garage, driveway, street, or even in your home, or no, you have not experienced flooding. I'll give that just 5 more seconds while we've still got answers coming in. Excellent. So I'm gonna go ahead and close that. Okay, we'll share results here. So it looks like mostly homeowners. Several folks had may know or had good guesses on what watershed we're in. Marisa will get into that for you. A couple I don't knows. That's great that you're here, because Marisa will definitely let you know. And where you've experienced flooding. So definitely folks have experienced flooding in yards, in basements, certainly in driveways and streets, and a little bit even in their home. So Marisa will get into solutions certainly that you can start to address in yards, which will be fantastic. All right, stop sharing that. And next slide, please. So I'd like to introduce our speaker for tonight. Marisa Immordino is the 2021-2022 AmeriCorps New Jersey Watershed Ambassador for the Millstone Watershed. It's a position hosted by the Watershed Institute. She is tasked with promoting watershed stewardship through delivering free presentations, organizing volunteer events, and monitoring stream health throughout the region. She graduated from Gettysburg College in 2020 with a BS in Environmental Studies. And thank you so much, Marisa. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. So hi, everyone. My name, again, is Marisa Immordino, and I am an AmeriCorps New Jersey Watershed Ambassador for the Millstone Watershed, also known as WMA 10. And my email is down there below. We'll see it again later. And yeah, I'll be presenting a little bit about what you and what we all can do about stormwater in this area. Next slide. So before I get into it, though, I did want to kind of go over what I'd be talking about tonight with a little outline. So I'll go over a little bit about what AmeriCorps is and what the Watershed Ambassadors program is. I'll then dive into what a watershed is, go into some details about New Jersey's watersheds, and of course, the Millstone Watershed. And then lastly, I'll use the last half of my presentation to talk about different types of engagement that we can do, some green infrastructure that I am personally familiar with, as well as a couple of resources for you all to access. Next slide. Alrighty, so AmeriCorps, if you haven't heard of AmeriCorps before, you can kind of think of us as a domestic Peace Corps. We do a lot of the same things as Peace Corps members, but we are just focused in the United States. Our terms of service are also a little bit shorter than most Peace Corps programs. I think theirs are about 2 years. Ours tend to be between 10 and 12 months, sometimes more, sometimes less. The program's been around for almost 30 years. And is essentially just a national service program that aims to improve lives and foster civic engagement. About 75,000 Americans every year will participate in AmeriCorps. And AmeriCorps itself, we do a lot of different things, mainly meeting critical community needs such as mentoring youth, fighting poverty, sustaining national parks, preparing for and recovering from disasters. Again, each program is different. The term of service for each program can also vary. Next slide, getting into my program more specifically. So I'm a part of the New Jersey Watershed Ambassadors program, also known as NJ WAP for short. We are administered by the Department of Environmental Protection down in Trenton, specifically in their division of water monitoring and standards. So each year from September to July, about 20 or so ambassadors are recruited to represent each of New Jersey's 20 watersheds. And throughout the term, we will promote watershed stewardship through education and direct community involvement, as well as monitoring stream health through performing visual and biological assessments. Each ambassador is also assigned a host agency. So I am assigned to the Watershed Institute in Pennington. Just shout out to them. They are super cool. And yeah, here are just some pictures from recent events that the cohort has done this year. Our cohort, I believe there are 21 of us this year. We also have 3 source water ambassadors. They're brand new. So they're in addition to the other watershed ambassadors, a part of our program. But rather than representing a watershed, they actually represent different regions. So we have one in the north, one in the central part of Jersey, and one in the south. And again, they work more with source water rather than just watersheds as a whole. So for these pictures, these were taken in the last couple of months. We did an invasive species pool up in Bedminster, and we did a couple of cleanups down in Trenton back in March, as well as a trail maintenance event out in Cheesequake State Park. Next slide. So whenever I go out to schools, organizations like this, I like to say that I wear 3 different hats. For one, I am an informal educator. So as a watershed ambassador, I am required to give a minimum of 50 presentations throughout my 10-month service term. So these can be given to schools, to groups like these, scouting groups, anyone who's interested in a presentation, they are more than welcome to have one. And they're mostly about watersheds, water quality. Again, that's kind of what our emphasis is. We also can do tabling events at conferences or festivals. We use a lot of really cool tools for our educations. So in these pictures here, you'll see an Enviroscape model. That's basically just a model of a watershed. We mainly use this to look at point source and non-point source pollution, as well as just showing what exactly a typical watershed looks like. The other part of my position, I'm also an outreach coordinator, so I have to run a minimum of 9 partnership projects throughout my service term. This can be anything from cleanups to tree plantings, green infrastructure workshops, anything that's directly benefiting our watershed communities is considered a partnership project. So the pictures over here, we did a dune grass planting as a cohort out at Island Beach State Park. We volunteered at a local food bank, as well as planted trees all throughout the state. And then lastly, the stream assessments, which I'll actually get into a little bit more later. So we are given about 11 or so sites by the DEP every year, all within our assigned areas. And we go out and we conduct some scientific assessments at those sites. So you can see a couple of pictures of us doing that there. Next slide. So what exactly is a watershed? I know I've said this word a lot so far. It's not a shed of water. That is an answer that I often get out in the schools. I do like that definition though, I will say, but a watershed is just an area of land where all of the water drains to one specific water body after a rain or a snowstorm event. So the model over here is actually a pretty good representation of that. You see that there is a storm cloud raining down on our watershed here, and then those white arrows are pointing to where exactly that water is going, in this case, the river. And of course, everything is a part of a watershed, including you. So humans are also a part of watersheds, as well as any non-living objects. So we have a city in here, we have a farm with some farm animals. Of course, we have our forest, we have a wetland, there's a factory there. All these things are considered part of a watershed and can impact our watersheds. Next slide. So New Jersey is home to 20 different watersheds. I mentioned that there are 20 ambassadors. So an ambassador is assigned to represent each of these watersheds every year. They're also all grouped into specific regions, and they're all named after the water body that they drain into. So for instance, watersheds 1, 2, and 11 make up the Northwest region. 3, 4, 5, and 6 make up the Northeast. The Raritan region makes up 7, 8, 9, and 10. Lower Delaware would be 20, 19, 18, and 17. And then lastly, we have Atlantic Coastal. So that's 12, 13, 14, 15, and 16. Another cool fact about the watersheds too is the borders themselves are not based on municipalities or towns. They're rather based on where that water is flowing. So there are a couple of towns throughout the state that are actually split between watersheds. So your neighbor, for instance, might be in one watershed and you could be in another, which is pretty cool. Next slide. And finally, our own watershed. So we all live in the Millstone Watershed. So I know we had that poll earlier. That's also the watershed that I represent. So the Millstone Watershed includes parts of Mercer, Monmouth, Middlesex, Somerset, and Hunterdon counties. Keyword being parts there. There's not a particular county in this watershed that's encompassed entirely. For instance, with Mercer County, about half of Mercer is in the Millstone, the other half being in the central Delaware, which is watershed 11. It is 265 square miles long and has over 15 municipalities. So Princeton is included in that. Our largest tributary is the Stony Brook. If any of you are familiar with that, it's about 38 miles long, though we do have a couple of other water bodies around, such as Rock Brook and Rocky Brook. We also have Cranberry Brook, and there's a bunch of names on this picture as well. And then of course, we're called the Millstone because all of our water will drain into the Millstone River. And the Millstone River itself is actually a tributary of the much larger Raritan River, which is a little bit north up in WMA 8. And the Raritan in turn will actually go up to the Raritan Bay by Sandy Hook, and then that water will go out into the Atlantic Ocean. So all the more reason why it is so important that we keep our waterways clean, because while the pollution and other things may not be impacting us right away, they could be impacting our neighbors. Next slide. All right, so now I'm going to go into the second half of my presentation. So I'm going to be covering different types of engagement, again, that we can all participate in, a little bit about green infrastructure. So again, a couple of projects that I have personally helped out with, as well as just some resources and takeaways for you all. Next slide. So this is a typical Watershed Ambassador stream assessment sheet. It looks like a lot when you first look at it, but based on just, having a degree in environmental studies and working with, a lot of scientific material, I can tell you this is not super complex. So a lot of our methods are really citizen science friendly, and they're designed for almost anyone to be able to use as long as you're trained in them. Next slide. But before I actually get into different protocol when it comes to assessing streams in New Jersey, I wanted to talk about the different types of streams that we can find in New Jersey. So our stream types, we have two. There are high gradient streams, which are also called rocky bottom. And then there are low gradient streams, also known as muddy bottom. I think those names are pretty self-explanatory, but rocky bottom just means that there's a lot of rocks at the bottom of the stream. So in the picture to the left over here, or my left at least, we have a lot of really big boulders, and there are rocks at the bottom of the water. This actually used to be one of my assessment sites. And then on the other one here, this is a muddy bottom. Again, instead of the bottom being made of rocks, it is full of mud and silt and sand. And you can kind of get a good idea of that in this picture here. So this is all based on the physiographic provinces of New Jersey. So we have, this picture only shows 4, there's actually 5 technically. So we have Valley and Ridge, Highlands, and Piedmont. In these regions here, you'll likely find high gradient or rocky bottom streams. And then south of that in the coastal plain. And then our 5th one, of course, is the Pinelands. So I believe that region would probably encompass where you're seeing the words coastal plain, and then a little bit to the right of that. You're going to mostly be seeing your muddy bottom streams. A really cool fact about our watershed, though, we actually have both types. So the 2 pictures that you're seeing were actually taken at stream assessment sites in this watershed that I had to assess last year. And part of the reason for that is because our watershed is right in between the Piedmont and the coastal plain, which is really cool because a lot of the other watersheds don't have that. Next slide. All right, so these are the 2 different types of assessments that we do as ambassadors. So we do a biological assessment and a habitat assessment. So these are just some pictures of that here. You can kind of get a good idea of what exactly our protocol is. So we have a couple ambassadors taking some measurements, determining velocity, and then of course, looking at some macroinvertebrates. We have a really cool Helgermite in this picture over here. Next slide. So for the habitat assessment, this is kind of how I will really go out in the field and do them, but I like to think of the habitat assessment as more of the numerical and the visual part of our assessments. So we'll take width, depth, and velocity measurements of the stream. For the velocity, which is actually kind of funny, we use this specifically weighted rubber duck. And we'll locate a riffle or a part of the stream where it's moving, and that's the average of like how fast that water is moving. And we'll stand about 3 meters apart from one another, and we'll send that duck in between the 2 of us and time when it starts and then when it passes the other ambassador, which is kind of fun. And then we're using a typical like meter stick and then a tape measure to determine that width and depth as well. We also do temperature. So we'll take the temperature of the water and the temperature of the air. Again, a lot of these tools are things that you will likely be able to find in your own homes, which is pretty cool. We'll then kind of second step, we'll observe some of the stream habitat characteristics. So we do have that data sheet again, where we're mostly checking off boxes, looking at things like what does the tree canopy look like, or what types of habitat or hiding places for the macroinvertebrates are we finding, or even land use characteristics. So if there's a farm nearby, we'll make a note of that, or if there's a major roadway nearby, we'll also make a note of that. And then of course, our third step, we want to be filling out our data sheet like throughout our collection. So that's actually a picture of me modeling that at one of our training events. Next slide. And then this is my personal favorite part of the assessment. So this is the biological assessment. So I mentioned before, we do a lot of work with macroinvertebrates. And if you don't know what a macroinvertebrate is, that is just a tiny bug that you're able to see without the need of a microscope that doesn't have a backbone. So macro, again, just means that there isn't you don't need a microscope to use that. And then invertebrate, again, just something that doesn't have a backbone. So I have a couple of different macros on the screen here. When we're trained on these guys, we look for specific characteristics. So like the one on my left here, this is a dragonfly nymph. So this guy will eventually grow up to have wings and look like a typical dragonfly. So one of the features of this guy is that he has 6 legs. And then of course, his bottom right here is pretty unique compared to some of the other macroinvertebrates. And this is also really showing like how we're sampling this too. So again, we're using, takeaway trays, we're using spoons and magnifying glasses, again, items that you are likely able to access in your own homes. And then the image on the right over here, in a takeaway tray, of course, kind of represents a typical sample that we will take at a site. So when we are out in the field, we will bring, our orange buckets, a sieve bucket, and of course a D-net. And we'll go out and we'll take about 20 or so samples and put those into our sieve bucket. And once we finish those 20, we'll transfer the bugs in that sieve bucket over to our bigger orange bucket, fill that up with water. And then one by one, we'll take a sample using these takeaway trays and then look for the macros inside and tally them. So in this tray right here, we have a couple of different types. So we have a damselfly, which is the box that is the closest to the left. Next to him, we have a really big crane fly and a couple of damselflies on top of him. Right above that, that little tiny red thing is a midge. They're pretty small, usually to use a magnifying glass to really see them. And then this one right here, I'm pretty sure is a lung snail. It could also just be a leaf or a shadow. I think this picture was taken on a pretty cloudy day, so it's a little bit hard to tell. But you can see that we have a lot of damselflies in this. We have a lot of crane flies. And what's also really cool about the macros too, is that we can use these guys to determine how polluted a particular stream is, because macroinvertebrates are really good indicators of pollution. So certain macroinvertebrates, like for instance, the dragonflies and the damselflies, are considered pollution sensitive. So they can tolerate a little bit of pollution, but not a lot. So if we're finding a lot of those, we can probably say that, oh, maybe there's a little bit of pollution in this stream. Other macroinvertebrates though, like leeches, are pollution tolerant. So they're able to tolerate a lot of pollution. So if we go out to a stream and we're finding a lot of leeches, that might tell us, okay, maybe there is a lot of pollution in this stream. And then other ones, so like mayflies and stoneflies, they're considered pollution intolerant. That means that they can't tolerate any pollution at all. So if we're finding a lot of mayflies and stoneflies, that might tell us, oh, okay, this stream is pretty healthy. Of course, we do want to find a pretty good variety of macros. That's also a good thing. You don't want to just be finding mayflies and stoneflies, even though those are considered the healthier ones. But yeah, the sampling is pretty cool, and the macroinvertebrates are also pretty cool. Next slide. And then, of course, other different types of engagement that we could all participate in. So I mentioned, with the stream assessments, we actually do trainings, the ambassadors do, where we help out on trainings throughout the year. They're called environmental stewardship trainings. So you actually have the opportunity to learn, how to do these assessments yourself. We also will go into classrooms or other educational centers and actually bring macroinvertebrates with us to show students, just to show them what exactly is living in the streams, in their yards or in their neighborhoods. But stewardship in general is one of the easiest ways to get involved. So two of the really big events that ambassadors will do mostly every year are cleanups and tree planting. So cleanups, I really like doing cleanups. Again, picking up trash reduces pollution and helps our environment. It's one of the easiest ways for you to help out and make sure there's not as much pollution. You don't necessarily have to go to a big event either. If you want to just walk around your own neighborhood and pick up trash, that's also really helpful. And then tree plantings, trees do so much for our environment. They can not only reduce the impact from flooding events. So if you've ever been to a tree planting before, you might notice that they're planting trees pretty close to a big river or stream. Once those trees get really big, the trees are able to suck up a lot of that water and reduce the amount of flooding that may happen otherwise. And of course, when they are a lot taller, they can provide habitat for wildlife. And especially around this time of year too, the trees are also just really pretty to look at. The spring, especially the fall too, when the leaves are changing colors, tree plantings they're just really great. And then other ways you can get involved too. So following local organizations or environmental commissions, you can also organize an event in your own neighborhood. And then of course, contacting your local watershed ambassador, which would be me in this case. But if we're not able to help you with something, then we could definitely direct you to someone that would be able to help you with a project. Next slide. All right, so the second part, I'll be talking a little bit about green infrastructure. Next slide. So there's two types I'm going to be covering today. Again, these are just the ones that I have the most experience with. Definitely one over the other, but rain barrels and rain gardens. Next slide. So I'll start off with rain gardens. So if you don't know what a rain garden is, it basically just collects rainwater from a roof, driveway, or street, and it allows that water to soak into the ground in a way that's not going to, release back onto the road. They are usually planted with native plants. I'll actually mention a tool you could use a little bit later in this presentation to help out with that. They're usually grasses and flowering perennials, though you might even have some more water-friendly plants in there. And then they mainly just filter out pollution and runoff, and they provide food and shelter for butterflies, birds, and other wildlife. You can actually cater the types of wildlife that will visit your rain garden based on what you planted it. So you could plant a pollinator garden, for instance, to attract a lot of butterflies and bees. You could plant some plants that birds really like so that they could visit the garden more often. They're pretty cool, and they look really pretty when they're properly maintained as well. Next slide. So this is a couple more pictures of that too. So I had to, of course, mention the rain garden over at the Watershed Institute. It's pretty cool. And then this other photo I actually pulled from Rutgers rain garden guide. And it's kind of just showing like how you would plant your plants based on where they're located in the rain garden. So this one, I think that dark green is the wettest part of the rain garden. So where the most water is. And then it kind of goes all the way out to moderate and then dry. So you'd be planting, like more water-friendly plants over at the base, and then maybe, some more plants that don't need as much water in the buffer areas. So pretty cool. Next slide. And then, of course, we have rain barrels. I really like rain barrels. I think that this is something that most people are able to do on their own. There are a lot of resources out there that you're able to use in order to build one yourself. But if you don't know what a rain barrel is, though, rain barrels basically just capture water from a roof of a home and can hold it for later use. It's usually around 50 gallons. That's the typical size of a rain barrel, though it does depend on how big you want to make your barrel. And they, of course, will reduce the amount of runoff that flows from your property. So you usually attach them to the side of your home underneath of a downspout. And rather than that water from the downspout going, into the grass and then eventually onto the road, it'll just go right into the barrel, and you're able to use that water for later use. So it can be used to water lawns or gardens. You could use it to clean your car if you wanted to, or other outdoor tools. I will say that you shouldn't drink your rain barrel water. That's probably not the greatest idea. And if you want to use it to water your fruit and vegetable gardens, or any other like herb gardens that you might, later eat, you definitely want to make sure you know what's in that water before you use it. Next slide. So these are just typical examples of what rain barrels might look like and what the structure of building a rain barrel will look like. I actually pulled this from a workshop that I did last year. So these type of barrels here, I like to call them the mesh method for barrels. So we just kind of use a big screen from a window, and we'll attach that to the top and seal it with that metal piece. And then, of course, we will drill our 2 holes for our faucet and our overflow. And you could also paint your barrels too. You have to sand them down, but I know that's pretty popular with people once they have them installed. And yeah, they're pretty cool. I know another question that often comes up is whether or not you can, how you keep mosquitoes away. So there are, I think it's called mosquito dunk. If you put that into the barrel, that should, it creates a surface coating on top of the water so that the mosquitoes aren't able to lay their eggs. They also recommend that you clean it out. I think it's once a week. You don't want to leave that water sitting there for too long, because if you do, then of course the mosquitoes will eventually come and lay their eggs in that water. Yeah, that's rain barrels. Next slide. A couple of other projects too. I don't really know a lot about these, but I figured that I would mention them. So you could use planter boxes or bioswales as like alternatives to rain barrels in keeping rainwater away from roads. Permeable pavements, similar idea. It's a little bit different from a road in that it allows the water to absorb into the the driveway or the sidewalk a little bit better than what a regular material would. Green roofs too, so that a little bit more common in urban areas, but you're planting, gardens or other like herbs and fruits and vegetables up on a roof where they're getting a lot of sunlight. It not only provides, good oxygen, but also, a source of food for a lot of people. And they look really pretty as well. And then land conservation, so not really a green infrastructure project, but more so just a really good idea to conserve land and maybe not build a building or something on it and kind of just leave it on its own and not impacting any of the waterways or the wildlife that live in that area. Next slide. All right, so my last slide will be just a resources and takeaways slide. So these are just some links and other things for volunteering and educational opportunities. I've of course linked the Jersey Watershed Ambassadors Program, the Watershed Institute, and Sustainable Princeton. I know the Sarlands Conservancy, which is based in Hopewell, has a lot of monitoring events going on that you could register for. DNR Greenway Land Trust is just a great place to visit. Also has some cool resources. And then Rutgers Cooperative Extension has a lot of educational opportunities. I know I'm personally enrolled in their Green Infrastructure Champions class right now. I've been learning a lot about different types of green infrastructure. That class is pretty cool. And then just some other green infrastructure resources. So again, from Rutgers, DEP, and EPA, those links will direct you to just other information that I may or may not have covered tonight. And then I think the Rutgers link may actually give you a PowerPoint for assembling your own rain barrel or rain garden, which is pretty cool. And then the last two, so the Jersey Friendly Plant Database and the Jersey Friendly Yard Tool. I mentioned these before with the rain gardens, but the plant database is really cool in that it allows you to be able to locate native plants to plant in your garden that are, native to New Jersey. And you can see what they look like and see the conditions they needed to be planted in. It'll also point out plants that are considered invasive. And then the Friendly Yard Tool is sort of similar to that. You can assemble your own garden in kind of on like the web page, and you could build it based on the different types of plants that you would want to plant in that garden. Yeah, and that's my last slide. So I will go ahead and take any questions.
Awesome, thank you. I've got a couple to start off. One is the work that you do as a watershed ambassador. You've got your term of service, and then folks are rotating through the assessments that you're doing and the monitoring that you're doing. Can you talk a little bit about sort of how that's tracked over time, and maybe even some of the streams that you have been monitoring, sort of what has changed even in the last since this is your second term of service, year of service. In a storm like Ida, obviously we can look around and see that streams changed in major ways, the big obvious ways. Most of us aren't getting down into the water to look at habitat characteristics and biological, indicators, but what's changed in even in the time that you've been doing this work?
Yeah, this is an awesome question. So I guess in terms of tracking the data itself, I know that our data complements what DEP does. So we're normally assigned sites that are near sites that they monitor. So we fill a lot of data gaps. Our data, I believe, can be accessed on NJ GeoWeb if you want to Google that. It's an ArcGIS kind of, I guess an app is the best word to use. And you can kind of pull up different layers to see what our data is saying. And you can see kind of the types of streams that you're able to monitor on that, and just ones that we've been able to monitor. And then also, we're also required to make legacy drives to pass down to other ambassadors as we switch over. So we make a top 10 contact list, we make a best streams, worst streams list, and we also do a little bit of a watershed tour, so pointing out different sites for the incoming ambassador to visit and to get to know the area a little bit better. What else? Oh, well, okay. Well, in terms of how it's changed since, because this is my second term with AmeriCorps. I don't know if I actually mentioned that. So I started my first term in September of 2020, finished that up in July of 2021, and then I opted to come back for a second term, which I started in September of 2021. And Ida was definitely changed a lot in terms of this watershed. So I had a couple of sites that I was assigned last year that were really great, and I liked them because they had a lot of macros and they were just really pretty. And Ida did a number on just how they look, and it got to the point where I couldn't access some of them, which was really sad. But I don't know. I've lived in New Jersey most of my life. I went to college, obviously outside, but this program really helped me kind of see a side of New Jersey that I didn't really know existed. 5 years ago, I probably wouldn't have been able to tell you what a stream is, or what a watershed is rather, or what types of what the names of the streams are near us. But yeah, you see a lot of changes. I know Ida did a number, particularly in the Raritan region, and being able to, especially with the flooding too. I know I had I had a tree planting event up in Manville, actually back in March of 2021. And I did find out the trees did do their job. Like it did help kind of prevent a little bit of that flooding, and that we didn't lose too many of those trees in that planting because they were very young. So that made me feel a little bit good that I helped with that a little bit. I think I answered most of that question.
Yeah, and actually, I guess there was one that came into the Q&A. You just talked about, following up on tree plantings. When folks get involved in tree plantings with, a variety of organizations, local organizations that we have, in and around Princeton or any, or in your program, how are projects like that usually followed up on? Are tree plantings and stream assessments and stream monitorings, do some of those go hand in hand? So you are maybe monitoring streams and also following up on tree planting projects, let's say?
Yeah, so it depends. So I know that with the stream assessments, we're obviously going back to some of those sites like every single year, so you're able to monitor it that way. Same with like the environmental stewardship trainings too. If we're offering the same, like say 2 ambassadors from different years offer the same program to the same group, you can monitor it that way. I know that we ask participants to give evaluations at our events, so getting that kind of feedback in terms of how we run things. If they're interested in having an event again, and maybe even giving us their contact information is pretty good. I know with the tree plantings is a little bit tricky. I think it really depends on like who is funding that. So I know that there was a Roots for Rivers funding opportunity a couple of years ago. I think I assisted on one of those plantings. So they may or may not have people coming out and monitoring. I know that a couple of ambassadors have like tree planting sites near their stream assessment areas, which is convenient. So they're not necessarily recording that data, but they might go over to that planting site and be like, oh, okay, like these tubes look fine. I know that programs, every year, I think this year we actually helped out with a tree planting like kind of update sort of project up in North Jersey. We were helping, install some more tubes, just check on the trees, see how they were doing health wise. So yeah, a complicated answer to that question. There's a lot of different ways that it can be done, I guess.
Yeah, sure. I'm also sure that all the organizations that are working hard in this area are not going to let all that good volunteer effort go to waste, and going to make sure that those trees are thriving. I'll mention quickly that Christine did put into the chat, if folks can see it, a link to the nj.gov GIS GeoWeb that Marisa mentioned. We will make sure that we post a link to that where you can access some of the data going back years on stream monitoring. Another question about, so a specific sort of cleanup, IDA impact and cleanup. Someone asked, a longtime user of the DNR canal towpath noticed that IDA caused a huge slug of plastic wrappers and other mostly plastic trash to flush through the canal, which then washed into the trees and brush. The canal overflowed into the Stony Brook. Would you envision any effort to understand what caused this, clean up the residual litter, and avert future garbage surge during future storms? I think sort of a bunch of very specific local projects. I'm sure there are folks interested in doing that. I don't know if you've heard of after Ida, was there a big push to do stream cleanups?
Yeah, so I know that DNR Canal does run like biannual cleanups like of their towpath. I actually helped AmeriCorps partnered up with state parks in March to do state park projects. So we all were assigned a state park and we were tasked with doing a project. So I actually did a towpath trek cleanup. I'm not sure of the same area, but it was at Bulls Island. And we cleaned like a 5-mile stretch of the towpath trek. So yeah, there's definitely projects going on.
And if people see, a particular problem area, who is a good organization? Is the Watershed Ambassador a good person to reach out to and say, hey,
yeah,
how can I organize a stream
definitely
cleanup?
The Watershed Ambassador. If not, if you're on the DNR, even reaching out to them, I feel like, I know that, yeah, again, IDA did a number like everywhere in the state practically. I myself have seen a lot of trash in areas that were not super trashy last year. I mean, it's wild, like how impactful that storm was and how wide the impact was.
Yeah, and certainly a good reminder of where your trash ends up. You don't always see it in waterways. Eventually, it does get there. Awesome. We have, let's see, a question about the Watershed Ambassador program. Where do Watershed Ambassadors go next? Do many of participants stay in the field? they say, I hope, especially you in your case, your enthusiasm is special.
Yeah, thank you. So it really depends. So I know with me, I actually am going to grad school after this. So I will be starting an MS program hopefully in watershed sciences. It'll be in natural resources, but a concentration in watershed sciences. So a lot of us do stay in this field. A lot of people end up working for DEP afterwards or for their host agencies, because a lot of them are nonprofits. I know the watershed has employed a couple of ambassador alum in the past couple of years. But yeah, we do end up in a lot of places. I know our alumni network is pretty widespread. We're all over the place, mostly again in New Jersey. But yeah, I'm hopeful that everyone else is also able to end up somewhere cool too, because we definitely do a lot. And not a lot of people know about this program either, which is why I took a lot of time to talk about it in the beginning, because we've been around for 22 years. And when people hear that, sometimes they're like, oh, like I've never heard of this before. And I'm like, yeah, we're here. So
Awesome. Let's see, one about, specific plant question about bamboo. How effective is it as a water barrier? I guess bamboo has a host of issues around it, one in invasive and being able to control it, but how can it be used responsibly in water management is maybe a question.
Yeah, good question. The only thing I know about bamboo is that it's invasive. I'm not entirely sure on what it does in terms of water, but I can definitely like look into that. That'd be interesting.
We can definitely, so anybody who has questions if we can't answer them here, we can follow up. We'll have your Zoom, we'll record your question with your email and we can try to send you to a good spot. How about, there's some of the resources that you shared, plant lists that would be good to use other than bamboo, native plants talked about.
That Jersey friendly like plant tool list is so cool. Like it names like, if the plant's native, I think it also talks about like what it does with the water. Yeah, definitely check out that list if you haven't already. It's a pretty cool list.
Awesome. Let's see, a question about basements, flooded basements, practical commercial flood barriers. That might be a technical construction question that if you don't know, I will say the engineering department, we sent a bunch of questions to Jim Purcell after the last talk, and maybe some technical questions about structure. The municipal department, I'm sure can be helpful there.
Yeah, not my area, but
okay.
Yeah.
All right. I guess just one more question that I can think of coming out of the last session. We talked about sort of the importance of regional partnerships, and your program is obviously a great example of statewide partners. When you work with watershed ambassadors, you're hosted at the Watershed Institute. Where else are watershed ambassadors hosted?
Good question. So I know we have one up at Raritan Headwaters. There's one at Highlands Preservation Alliance. We also have a couple that are just at like Bulls Island Recreation Area. That state park also has one. Our website does list where everyone is. So I did include that link in that last slide. I think there is a story maps page that introduces you to the ambassador and it tells you like where they're hosted at. But it's a mix of nonprofits, of government, agencies, that kind of thing.
Great. Okay. Excellent. And a couple more links that Christine is putting into the chat for everyone. We'll make sure that those get posted to our webinar archive on our website, along with these slides to share more links. And actually, Christine, if you would, if you've got the slides handy, if you can reshare them, because we actually have, there's a stream cleanup. If the flyer doesn't pop up for you here, we'll make sure it's posted. There's a stream cleanup at Hilltop Park, which is 782 Bunn Drive in Princeton on April 24th from 9 to 11. That is hosted by the Princeton Environmental Commission and the Watershed Institute. So if anyone is looking to get involved in a stream cleanup, spread the word about a stream cleanup coming up around Earth Day at the end of the month, this is a great opportunity. And the Watershed, I know, does also have at this watershed.org/stream cleanups others listed around.
Yeah. They start
the
this
area.
weekend. I think it's April 9th, April 23rd, and 24th. And the website lists where all of them are happening too. So if you're interested in getting involved, they're not all in Princeton, but they're like close enough that you'd be able to get to them like without driving too far.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much. Oh, Christine sending a note, the municipality's engineering department can help with, oh, sorry, that was an answer to another question. I'm diving into the chats, which is what I said we wouldn't do. All right. Well, thank you so much, Marisa. Thank you to everyone for tuning in. We will have more information on our next topic for sustainable mines coming out soon, but look for that. Sign up for our newsletter. And again, look for this recording on our website and more resources in the next couple of days. So thank you so much. We'll sign off now. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.